came home to a key that no longer worked. That was the first thing. Not a phone call, not a conversation at the kitchen table, not even an argument. Just a key that turned halfway and stopped. I stood on my own front porch for a full minute, trying it again, turning it the other direction the way you do when you're sure it's your fault somehow. It wasn't my fault. The lock had been changed. There was an envelope taped to the door, my name on the front and her handwriting. Neat, careful, the same handwriting I'd watched sign our mortgage 31 years ago. I didn't open it right there. I don't know why. I just pulled it off the door and stood there with it in my hand, looking at the house I had paid for, the house where I had mowed the lawn every Saturday for 3 decades, the house where my daughter had learned to ride a bike in the driveway. I stood there until the neighbor's dog started barking, and then I walked back to my truck and sat in the driver's seat and opened the envelope. The house is under contract. I've already spoken to an attorney. I need you to make other arrangements. There's a storage unit on Caldwell Road. I had your things moved. The code is 4471. I'm sorry it came to this, but I've made my decision. Miriam. That was it. 31 years, and that was the whole of it. I'm sorry it came to this. I sat in that truck for a long time, long enough for the sun to move. I wasn't crying. I want to be clear about that, not because I think there's anything wrong with crying, but because what I felt wasn't sadness, not right then. It was something closer to the feeling you get when a doctor says something unexpected, that cold, very still moment before your brain catches up to what your ears just heard. My name is Philip. I'm 63 years old. I spent 38 years as a commercial estimator, mostly industrial construction, the kind of work that requires you to read a job site before the blueprints are even dry. You learn to spot the thing that doesn't fit, the detail that's off. I had missed this one entirely, and that bothered me almost as much as anything else. Miriam and I had been married since 1993. We had 2 kids, our daughter Lena, who lives in Portland now with her husband and their boy, and our son, who I'll just call my son because he prefers to keep his life private, and I respect that. The marriage had quieted in recent years. I knew that. We had drifted into parallel lives more than a shared one. I traveled for work more than I should have, and when I stopped traveling, I wasn't sure we remembered how to be in the same room together. But I did not think we were done. I thought we were just people in their 60s who had gotten a little lost and needed to find their way back. I was wrong about that. I found out later, much later, that she had been seeing a man named Sutton for almost 2 years. Sutton ran a small landscaping company and had done some work at a neighbor's property on our street. That's how they met, apparently. I don't know all the details, and I've stopped wanting to. What I do know is that she had been planning the exit for quite some time before that envelope appeared on my door. The house. That was the piece that didn't make sense. We had bought the property together, both names on the deed. I knew the law well enough to know that you can't simply sell jointly owned real property without both parties signing, which meant something had gone wrong somewhere in the paperwork, or something had gone wrong with me specifically. I drove to the storage unit on Caldwell Road, put in the code, and looked at my belongings stacked in cardboard boxes like the contents of an office after a layoff. Someone had packed my books. Someone had packed my books. My grandfather's tackle box was in there, sitting on top of a garbage bag full of winter coats. I closed the door and called my daughter. She didn't know. I could tell immediately she didn't know, and I was relieved by that, even though the conversation was painful in the way those conversations always are. She cried. I told her not to. She asked me where I was staying, and I said I hadn't figured that out yet, which was true. I ended up at a Holiday Inn off the interstate for 8 days while I got my bearings. The second call I made was to an attorney, a woman named Margaret, not a friend, just someone who had been recommended to me years ago and whose card I'd held on to without knowing why. I called her the morning after the envelope. I sat in the hotel room with bad coffee and my reading glasses, and I told her the story from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you know if there's a power of attorney document with your signature on it?" I told her I didn't think so. She said, "That's the piece I'd want to look at first." She explained it plainly. The way a spouse can sometimes complete a real estate transaction without the other party present is through a power of attorney. A legal document where one person authorizes another to act on their behalf. If Miriam had filed a POA with my name on it, she could have signed my portion of the closing documents herself. Whether that signature was legitimate was a different question entirely. I went home that afternoon, or tried to. I drove to the house and sat in the driveway and looked at it. There was a lockbox on the front door now, the kind realtors use. I took a photograph of it. Then I drove to the county recorder's office and asked to see the deed history on the property. The clerk was a patient man. He walked me through it without making me feel stupid. The house had been sold, or rather, a purchase agreement had been executed, and a power of attorney document had been filed in connection with the transaction. Signed, supposedly, by me. I had never signed a power of attorney. I knew what my signature looked like. I'd been signing it for 63 years. The signature on that document was a reasonable imitation, but it wasn't mine. The way I crossed the L in my last name, the slight lift before the final stroke, it wasn't there. Small thing, but I'd spent decades reading documents in this industry, and I knew my own hand. I photographed everything the clerk allowed me to photograph. I went back to the hotel, spread the papers on the bed, and called Margaret. She was quiet for a moment when I told her. Then she said, "Philip, that's forgery." I said I thought it might be. She told me we needed to move carefully. Not fast, carefully. There was a difference, she said, and it mattered. If we went in loud and aggressive, Miriam's attorney would have time to reframe the narrative, claim I had signed and forgotten, claim I had verbal authorization, cloud the record. If we moved methodically, with documentation in place before we filed anything, the case would be cleaner. I said I would follow her lead. There's a quality that my father called steadiness. Not patience exactly, but the capacity to keep your hands on the wheel when the road gets bad. He was a carpenter. He used to say the most dangerous moment on a job site is when something goes wrong and everyone starts moving fast. Panic costs more than the original mistake. I thought about that a lot during those weeks. I thought about it every morning in that hotel room, looking at the highway outside the window, drinking my bad coffee. Margaret and I began building the file. She subpoenaed the closing documents. She obtained a handwriting analysis from a forensic specialist, a retired FBI examiner out of Chicago who had testified in over 400 cases. His conclusion, in writing, was that the signature on the POA bore significant inconsistencies with known exemplars of my handwriting and was, in his professional opinion, likely produced by a different individual. Meanwhile, I did some looking of my own. Sutton, the man Miriam had been seeing, had a business that was more debt than asset. I had a contact from my old industry days, a man named Archie, who had spent 20 years in commercial lending before he retired. I described the situation to Archie over dinner one evening, and he knew what to look for. Public records, business filings, UCC filings, which are documents lenders use to secure interest in a borrower's assets. Sutton had 3 of them against his landscaping equipment and 1 against a small piece of commercial property he was trying to develop. He owed, by our rough count, somewhere close to $340,000 to various creditors. One of those creditors was a regional lender that Archie happened to know. Archie made a call, not an improper one, a simple inquiry about whether the note was performing and whether the holder had any interest in selling. The note, one of the smaller ones, about $190,000 secured against Sutton's equipment, was not performing. The lender had been trying to work it out for 8 months. They were tired of it. I purchased it. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't purely strategic, not at first. There was a part of me that was angry in the way that only becomes possible after the numbness wears off. A cold, deliberate kind of anger. The kind that doesn't shout. I had spent 31 years building a life with that woman. I had worked in the rain and the heat, and I had come home, and I had tried to be a decent husband even when I wasn't always a present one, and she had forged my name on a legal document to take our home. Something in me needed the accounting to be accurate, not vengeful. Accurate, but there was also a legal reason which Margaret helped me understand later. If Sutton received material financial benefit from the fraudulent transaction, and he had because the plan was for him and Miriam to use proceeds from the house sale to pay off his debts and start fresh, then he was potentially a party to the fraud, which meant that holding his debt gave me a position in any eventual proceeding that was considerably more useful than simply being the wronged party. "Jess," my daughter said later when I explained it to her. I told her I'd just been reading the site. The case moved through the courts more slowly than I would have liked and faster than I feared. Margaret filed a motion to void the real estate transaction on the grounds of fraudulent execution of the POA. The buyers, a young couple who had no idea any of this was happening, were notified and their earnest money was held in escrow pending resolution. I felt badly for them. They had done nothing wrong and found themselves inside someone else's disaster. Margaret's office kept them informed throughout. Miriam's attorney argued that the transaction was valid, that I had verbally authorized the POA, that this was a manufactured dispute designed to harass his client. The judge asked him to explain why a forensic document examiner with 400 cases of testimony had concluded the signature was not mine. He did not have a satisfying answer to that. The judge's ruling was not dramatic, which is the way it usually is with important things. She voided the transaction. The POA was declared fraudulent. The property reverted to joint marital ownership pending formal divorce proceedings. Outside the courtroom, Sutton's attorney, a young man in a suit that was a little too big for him, approached Margaret and said that my acquisition of the debt note was an attempt to weaponize the legal process, that it was unfair and coercive. Margaret looked at him for a moment and then said, "Purchasing a performing debt instrument through a willing seller is a standard financial transaction. It has nothing to do with this case, and it would be in your client's interest to remain current." She said it very calmly. I liked that about her. The divorce proceedings were what they were. I won't go through all of it. Property division, retirement accounts, the question of what 31 years of joint contribution is worth when reduced to a spreadsheet. It is not a pleasant process. There were days when I drove to the storage unit on Caldwell Road just to sit in the parking lot and think, which is probably not the healthiest habit, but it was mine. Lena came out from Portland for 2 weeks in the middle of it all. She helped me find an apartment, a reasonable place on the second floor of a building near the river with windows that get good light in the morning. She put up curtains. She bought me a coffee maker that was better than the ones at the Holiday Inn. She didn't ask me too many questions, and I was grateful for that. My son called every Sunday. We talked about baseball mostly. That was also fine. Sutton called me once. I don't know how he got my number. He called on a Tuesday afternoon, and I was in my truck when the unfamiliar number came up. I almost didn't answer. He wanted to talk about the debt. He said he was having a hard time, that things hadn't worked out the way he planned, that he just needed a little more time. I listened to him for a while. He had a mild voice, softer than I expected. I remember thinking that he probably seemed very agreeable in person, the kind of man who is easy to like in short doses. I told him that I wasn't in the business of hardship accommodations, and that if he wanted to discuss the terms of the note, he should contact my attorney. He asked if there was any chance we could work something out directly, just man to man. I said, "I am working something out. This is what that looks like." Then I ended the call. I sold the house during the divorce settlement, split the proceeds as required, and used my portion to put a down payment on a small place in a town about 40 minutes from where we lived. I didn't want to stay in the same neighborhood. Too many people who knew both of us. Too many questions I didn't want to answer in parking lots. The new house needs work. The back deck is soft in 2 places, and the kitchen is 20 years out of date. I've been doing it slowly, weekend by weekend, the way I used to do things, before I had a company truck and a schedule. I pulled up the deck boards myself and found the joists were salvageable, which was a relief. My neighbor, a retired electrician named Paul, came over one Saturday and helped me for a few hours without being asked. We didn't talk much, just worked. That was the best afternoon I'd had in a long time. There are still moments, mostly in the early morning before I'm fully awake, where I reach for the shape of the life I used to have. It's a reflex more than a feeling. I don't miss Miriam the way I thought I would, which is its own strange thing to sit with. I think what I miss is the version of the life I thought we had. The one that turned out to be, in some important ways, not quite real. But the house on Caldwell Road is mine now, or at least the apartment near the river was mine, and the new house is mine, and my grandfather's tackle box is on a shelf in the garage where I can see it from the workbench. My key works. That sounds like a small thing, and I know it does. But on the first night I slept in the new place, I put the key in the lock and turned it, and the door opened, and I stood there for a second before I went inside. Some things you don't know you need until you have them back. The morning after the judge's ruling, Margaret called to let me know the decision had been entered into the record. I thanked her. She said I had handled the whole process with more composure than most of her clients. I didn't quite know what to say to that, so I said something about the coffee being better on good news days. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that means you caught someone off guard. I hung up and sat for a while in the hotel room. I was back at the Holiday Inn for a few days while the apartment was being arranged, and looked out at the same highway I'd been looking at for months. The traffic moved the same way it always did. Everyone going somewhere, no one looking at each other. I thought about what my father used to say about steady hands. I thought about the envelope on the door, and the key that didn't work, and the way the whole thing had arrived in my life without warning on an ordinary Tuesday. And then I finished my coffee and made a list of what needed doing next, because that's the only thing that has ever actually helped. Not the anger, not the grief, not the very human desire to understand why someone you trusted chose to do what they did. Just the list. Just the next thing. The deck has 2 more sections to go. Paul said he'd come back on Saturday if the weather holds. I think the weather's going to hold. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not just the legal part, not just the paperwork in the courtroom and the hours in that Holiday Inn with bad coffee, but the whole shape of it. What it means when someone you built a life with decides to end it the way Miriam did, not with honesty, with a forged signature and a changed lock. There's a version of the story where I fell apart. I could have. There were mornings in that hotel room where falling apart felt like the reasonable response. But I've come to believe that the way a person responds to being wronged reveals more about their character than the wrong itself. Miriam made her choices. What I did with mine, that was the only part I actually controlled. I think about the forged signature a lot, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clarity. When someone decides to deceive you rather than confront you, they are telling you something true about themselves. They're telling you they believed they couldn't face you directly, that the conversation was too hard, the accountability too much. In a strange way, the forgery told me more about the state of our marriage than 31 years of ordinary days had. She didn't leave because she stopped caring. She left the way she did because she never quite believed I would stand up. That's the part that stayed with me longest. I'm not a man who talks about himself easily. I spent most of my working life reading blueprints and calculating risk and keeping my opinions inside until they were useful. That kind of steadiness can look like passivity from the outside. And I think Miriam mistook it for that. She thought quiet meant compliant. She thought patience meant I'd take whatever was handed to me and find somewhere else to sleep and let the thing stand. She miscalculated, not because I'm harder than she thought, but because I had spent 63 years learning that the right response to a bad situation is almost never the fastest one. Margaret told me early on, move carefully, not quickly. I already knew that. My father taught it to me on job sites before I was old enough to drive. The man who panics costs more than the original mistake. Sutton called me once looking for accommodation on the debt. He had a soft voice and a reasonable manner, and I'm sure he was very persuasive in other circumstances. But I had purchased that note legally through a willing seller at a fair price. There was nothing unfair about it. What's unfair is forging a man's signature on a document so you can take his house. Compared to that, the rest was just arithmetic. Lena asked me once if I was bitter. I thought about it honestly before I answered her. Bitter is when the thing that happened to you becomes the thing that defines you. I didn't want that. I wanted the accounting to be accurate for every action in the story to have its corresponding result, and then I wanted to get on with the next part of my life. The deck that needs fixing, the apartment near the river with good morning light, Paul coming over on Saturday to help without being asked. What I know now, that I didn't fully understand before, is that integrity is not a performance. It's not something you demonstrate to other people. It's something you maintain for yourself. In the small decisions, in the moments when no one is watching and the easier path is right there. I could have walked away from the forged signature, taken whatever settlement was offered and let it go. Some people would call that pragmatic. I call it letting an inaccurate story stand. And I am, at my core, a man who reads the documents carefully. The house is sold now, properly and fairly, and the proceeds were divided as the law requires, and I have a place of my own where my key works in the lock. That sounds modest? Maybe it is, but on the first night I slept there, I turned that key and the door opened, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before I went inside. Sometimes the smallest things are the whole point.